What would you do if your only inheritance was a tombstone? Not a plot of land in a quiet churchyard, but a 90-year-old railroad disaster. A single boxcar plunged nose down into the unforgiving earth of a forgotten ravine. For 20-year-old Wren Delaney, this wasn't a question to be pondered. It was the sum total of her father's life, handed to her on a brittle yellow deed. The people of Copper Gulch had called the wreck the Iron Needle, for as long as anyone could remember. A rusted monument to failure, stitched into the desolate landscape. But the truth, waiting inside that steel shell, a truth sealed away from the world for nearly a century, was about to unravel everything they thought they knew about the land, about failure, and about the quiet girl they had already written off as lost. Settle in, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we tell a story of patience, grit, and a discovery that changed a valley forever. Wren Delaney stepped off the morning stage into the familiar dust of Copper Gulch, a dust that seemed to hold the memory of every hope that had ever dried up and blown away within its borders. She carried a single carpet bag containing 3 dresses, her father's shaving razor, and a hollowness that felt heavier than any luggage. The funeral had been 2 days prior, a sparse affair, attended by a handful of his old railroad crew and the town preacher, who spoke of her father, Thomas Delaney, in vague, kind terms that did nothing to fill the shape of the man he'd been. A man of quiet disappointments, of projects that never quite panned out, of a spirit worn smooth by the relentless friction of a hard life. The town's gaze felt like a physical weight. They looked at her with a pity so thick it was nearly contempt, seeing in her the final, lonely chapter of the Delaney family's slow decline. She was the last of her line, and she had inherited nothing but the dust on her boots. That evening, a knock came at the door of the small room she'd taken above the mercantile. It was Jedediah Stone, his face a roadmap of wrinkles carved by sun and time, his hands thick and calloused from a lifetime working the rails alongside her father. He held his hat in his hands, a gesture of respect that made the ache in Wren's chest tighten. He didn't offer platitudes or condolences. Instead, he handed her a folded document, its creases as deep as his own. "He filed this last month," Jed said, his voice a low rumble, "paid the back taxes on it, said it was the only thing he had left that was truly his. Wanted to make sure you got it." Wren unfolded the paper under the low light of a kerosene lamp. It was a deed, not to the small mortgaged house the bank had already claimed, nor to any parcel of land with timber or grazing rights. The legal description was stark, almost poetic in its desolation. All that tract of land known as Tumble Creek Ravine, commencing at the old Surveyor's Oak and running west to the ridgeline, encompassing the entirety of the canyon and all its contents, including the wreckage of Great Northern Boxcar 734, lost in the derailment of '88. She stared at the words. The Iron Needle, the town's oldest joke and its most solemn ghost story. A train wreck from 1888. A catastrophe that had bankrupted the first rail spur into the valley and left a single car speared into the ravine floor, where it had stood, rusting under 90 years of sun and snow. It was a landmark of futility, a place parents warned their children away from, and it was hers, her only inheritance. "Why?" she whispered, not to Jed, but to the ghost of her father. Jed just shook his head slowly. He never said, "Wren, your pa." He saw things different, always did. He placed a heavy hand on her shoulder for a moment, a silent acknowledgement of their shared loss, and then he was gone, leaving her alone with the lamplight, the deed, and the deed to a grave. The paper felt impossibly heavy, the final testament of a man who had spent his life chasing whispers and was leaving his only child a monument to a shout of failure. A cold wind rattled the window pane, and outside, the town of Copper Gulch settled into a quiet, judgmental sleep, certain it knew exactly how this story would end. The next morning, Wren walked to the county clerk's office, the deed held tight in her hand. The air inside was stale with the scent of old paper and sealing wax. Mr. Abernathy, a man whose frame seemed to be shrinking into his clothes, peered at her over his spectacles as she laid the document on the counter. He read it once, then twice, his thin eyebrows climbing toward his hairline. "The Tumble Creek Ravine?" he asked, his voice a dry rustle. "Child, there's nothing there but rock, rattlers, and that old wreck. Thomas actually paid the taxes on this." The question hung in the air, thick with disbelief. Before Wren could answer, a louder voice boomed from the doorway. "He's not the first fool to own it, and it seems he won't be the last." Silas Blackwood filled the doorway, a man built of broad shoulders and loud opinions. He was the town's foremost land agent, a buyer of distressed properties, and a connoisseur of other people's misfortunes. He strode in, his polished boots loud on the floorboards, and glanced at the deed with a dismissive smirk. "The Iron Needle. Good Lord. My condolences on your father, miss, but it seems his poor judgment was a condition that ran right to the end." He turned to Abernathy, waving a hand, as if clearing away a bad smell. "The land's worthless. The water rights belong to the ridge. The timber was logged out 50 years ago, and the car itself is so brittle, it turned to dust if you tried to salvage it for scrap. It's the Gulch's tombstone, nothing more." Wren felt a flare of heat in her cheeks, but she held her tongue, just as her father had always done in the face of mockery. She pushed the deed forward an inch. "I'm here to file the transfer," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Blackwood laughed, a short, barking sound. "File away, frame it. Hang it on your wall as a reminder that sentiment is the most expensive luxury a person can own." He tipped his hat with mocking formality and left, his laughter echoing in the dusty office. Mr. Abernathy sighed, stamped the deed with a heavy thud, and recorded the transfer in his ledger. Wren Delaney was now the official owner of a ghost. Later that day, she walked to the Overlook, a place she hadn't visited since she was a small girl clutching her father's hand. The wind was sharp, carrying the scent of pine and dry earth. Below, the ravine split the landscape like a wound, and there it was, the Iron Needle. It stood canted at an impossible angle, its rusted red steel a stark slash of color against the gray rock. It was plunged deep into the earth, its top half exposed to the sky, looking for all the world like a colossal, abandoned tool. It was bigger and more desolate than she remembered. It didn't look like an inheritance. It looked like an ending. She stood there for a long time, the wind whipping strands of hair across her face, the silence of the place pressing in on her. What secret could a place like this possibly hold? Why would her father pour his last dollars into owning this specific piece of failure? And what was she, with nothing left to her name, supposed to do with it now? Let us know in the comments what you think her father's motive was, and don't forget to subscribe for the rest of Wren's incredible story. For now, all she knew was the cold wind and the long shadow the wreck cast over the valley, a shadow that now belonged entirely to her. The whispers in town started before she even bought her first length of rope. They were a low current in the general store, a sudden silence in the saloon when she passed by the swinging doors. "Delaney's girl," they'd murmur, "gone and lost her senses. Grieving, poor thing." They saw her buying heavy canvas, a new head for a pickaxe, and tin plates, and they shook their heads, mistaking quiet determination for a fool's errand. The storekeeper, a kindly man named Elias, hesitated as he measured out 50 feet of thick hemp rope. "Wren," he said, his voice gentle, "there's nothing down there. We all know the story. The scavengers picked that car clean the week after it crashed. Took the mail, the luggage, anything of value. Left the heavy freight because it was busted open and worthless. It's just a shell." She met his gaze, her own steady. "My father left it to me, Elias. I mean to see it up close." He said no more, simply took her money with a sad, paternal sigh, the transaction feeling more like an indulgence than a sale. That afternoon, as she was loading her supplies onto the back of Dust, her father's old mule, a figure detached itself from the shadows of the livery stable. It was Elara Vance, a woman so old her face seemed made of the same cracked, dry earth as the gulch itself. She was the town's memory, the last living person who claimed to remember the sound of the crash echoing through the valley as a child. She moved slowly, her hand resting on a gnarled cottonwood cane. She stopped beside Wren and reached out a hand that was little more than bird bones and parchment skin, placing it on Wren's forearm. Her touch was surprisingly firm. Her eyes, clouded with age, seemed to look straight through Wren. "They all look at the rust," the old woman rasped, her voice like stones grinding together. "They forget about the roots." She squeezed Wren's arm once, a brief, emphatic pressure. "Some things don't fall," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. They wait, and then she was gone, shuffling back into the shadows, leaving Wren with a chill that had nothing to do with the afternoon breeze. The encounter was still unsettling her when Silas Blackwood found her near the edge of town. He reined in his handsome bay horse, looking down at her and the laden mule with an expression of profound pity. "Miss Delaney," he began, his tone dripping with condescension, "this has gone far enough. The whole town is talking. It's unseemly." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small clutch of bills. "Here, $20. For the deed. It's more than anyone in their right mind would pay, but I'll consider it a charitable donation to your father's memory. Take the money, get on the next stage, and go start a life somewhere else. There's nothing for you here but a bad memory." The offer was a public humiliation, delivered on the main track out of town for all to see. Wren looked from the money in his hand to his smug, assured face. She thought of her father's quiet persistence, of the way he'd absorbed a lifetime of similar dismissals. She thought of Elara Vance's strange, cryptic words. She said nothing. She simply shook her head, a small, resolute gesture. She took hold of Dust's lead rope and clicked her tongue, urging the old mule forward. She walked past Blackwood and his horse, leaving him sitting there with his charity outstretched and his mouth agape. Her silence was a louder refusal than any shout could have been. She didn't look back. Ahead of her lay the trail to Tumble Creek Ravine, and behind her, a town that had already buried her. The weight of their judgment was heavy, but the pull of the unknown, of her father's final, inexplicable act, was stronger. The journey to the ravine took the better part of a day. The trail was little more than a game path, overgrown and forgotten, winding its way up into the rocky, arid hills that formed the western wall of the valley. Wren led Dust, the mule's hooves sure and steady on the uneven ground. The animal was old, gray in the muzzle, and as quietly stubborn as she was. He had been her father's constant companion, a silent witness to his solitary wanderings. Now he was hers. The sun beat down, and the air grew thin and still, the only sounds the creak of the leather packs, the plod of hooves on stone, and the buzz of insects in the dry brush. By late afternoon, the familiar shape of the valley had fallen away behind them, replaced by a starker, wilder landscape. The trees grew stunted and twisted, clinging to the rock. The silence here was different from the silence of the town. It was older, deeper, a silence that listened. They arrived at the rim of the ravine as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The sight stole the breath from her lungs. From here, the wreck of Car 734 was not just a landmark, it was a presence. It dominated the canyon floor, a wounded iron beast bleeding rust into the earth. It seemed to defy gravity, to protest its own demise, its back half still angled toward the sky, where the tracks had once been, its front half buried deep in the rocky ground, as if it had tried to burrow into the stone. The scale of the violence that had put it there was palpable. A 90-year-old scream still echoing in the rocks. A profound sense of disappointment washed over Wren. It looked exactly as everyone had described it, a ruin, useless, dead. Her father's final folly seemed stark and undeniable in the fading light. She made camp a safe distance from the rim, building a small fire not for warmth but for comfort against the encroaching dark. She shared a portion of her dried beef and hardtack with Dust, who watched the ravine with his ears pricked forward, occasionally letting out a low, rumbling snort. As night fell, the ravine came alive with sound. The wind, funneled through the canyon, made a low, mournful sigh as it passed over the car's metal hide. And beneath that, another sound, a deep, intermittent groaning. It was the sound of stressed metal, of rivets and beams shifting by fractions of an inch under the immense, patient pressure of their own weight. It sounded like the wreck was breathing. Wren pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, the fire casting flickering shadows against the rocks. She felt an acute, piercing loneliness. She had come all this way, chasing the ghost of a reason, only to find a place as empty and broken as she felt. She slept fitfully, the groaning of the iron giant below her, weaving itself into her dreams, a long, slow lament for a journey that had ended in disaster. The first night, she learned only that the place was as sad as its story. For 3 days, Wren did little more than observe. She circled the ravine's rim, studying the wreck from every angle, committing its strange, broken geometry to memory. The initial wave of disappointment gave way to a quiet, gnawing curiosity. Her father had not been a sentimental man. If he had spent his last resources on this place, he had a reason. He saw something no one else did. On the 4th morning, she decided she could learn no more from a distance. She left Dust tethered in a patch of shade and began her descent, the coil of rope slung over her shoulder. The sides of the ravine were steep, a treacherous scree of loose rock and thorny brush. She moved slowly, testing each handhold and foothold, the silence broken by the skittering of dislodged pebbles. As she got closer, the true size of the boxcar became apparent. It was immense, a cathedral of rust. The paint was almost entirely gone, peeled away by decades of weather. But on one shadowed flank, she could just make out the faint, ghostly lettering, Great Northern. The force of the impact had buckled its steel plates, and the wooden frame within was splintered and exposed like broken ribs. She finally reached the bottom and stood in the car's shadow, craning her neck to look up at its impossible angle. It was wedged tight into a deep fissure in the ravine floor, a crack in the bedrock itself. This was the first detail that didn't fit the town's story. They spoke of it as if it were resting on the ground. But it wasn't resting. It was pinned, impaled. She began the slow work of clearing the brush and debris that had accumulated around its base. It was mindless labor, but her hands needed to be busy. She worked for hours under the hot sun, her world shrinking to the scrape of her shovel and the snap of dry branches. It was during this work that the second anomaly appeared. As she pulled away a thick, gnarled mesquite bush, she startled a small gray fox. It darted out from a dark space, directly beneath the downward plunging nose of the car, a space that shouldn't have been there. It vanished into the rocks on the far side of the canyon. Wren paused, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a dirty glove. She peered into the opening the fox had used. It was a narrow gap between the crumpled steel of the car's front and the hard granite of the fissure wall. An animal den, nothing more. And yet, her eyes traced the line of the boxcar's wall, moving upward from the strange little gap. There, about chest high and 10 feet from the main cargo door, was a set of markings. They were faint, hand-etched into the steel, their lines filled with the fine dust of 90 years. They were not railroad markings. She ran her fingers over them, tracing the shapes. It was a perfect, 8-pointed compass rose, no bigger than her palm, and beneath it, a series of numbers and letters, almost like a code, 44R 112 L3. She stared at it, a prickle of unease running up her spine. It was deliberate. It was precise. It was a sign left by a thinking hand, a message that had waited patiently under the sun and the stars, ignored by the scavengers and storytellers. It was the first clue that this was not just a wreck. It was a lockbox. The sound of the wind through the canyon seemed to change, shifting from a mournful sigh to a conspiratorial whisper. The markings became Wren's obsession. For days, she did nothing but try to decipher them. 44R 12L3. It felt like a combination, a sequence of turns. But for what? The main cargo doors were hopelessly jammed, their locking bars bent and rusted into a solid mass. She tried them against every bolt and rivet she could find, but nothing matched. The frustration mounted, a familiar echo of her father's own quiet, desperate, puzzling over schematics and half-drawn plans. She felt close to him in that ravine, closer than she had in years. She took to working, letting her hands solve the problem her mind could not. The labor was a balm. She decided to clear the entire base of the car, to expose whatever foundation it rested upon. It was a monumental task. She used the pickaxe to break up compacted earth and fallen rock, then shoveled it away. Dust, the old mule, proved his worth. She rigged a simple pulley system to a sturdy outcrop of rock, and the mule patiently hauled baskets of debris up and away from the site. Days bled into a week, then two. Her hands, soft from a year spent away at a boarding school her father could ill afford, became calloused, then split, then healed into tough, capable leather. She learned the physics of the wreck, the way it groaned when the morning sun hit the steel, the points where its weight was most heavily settled. She was no longer just its owner. She was its student, its caretaker. It was during this relentless excavation, while clearing a deep deposit of mud and scree from beneath the very nose of the car, that her shovel struck something that wasn't rock. It was a sharp, metallic clang. Heart-pounding, she dropped to her knees and began to dig with her hands. She clawed away the damp, heavy earth, revealing a flat, square plate of steel, different in texture from the rest of the car. It was set flush into what would have been the very bottom of the boxcar's front wall. In its center was a recessed wheel-like handle, and beside it, a complex-looking keyhole set within a circular dial. It was a secondary hatch, a safe. She scrambled back to her feet, her eyes darting from the hidden hatch up to the markings on the wall. A compass rose. R for right, L for left, the numbers. It was the combination. It wasn't for the main doors. It was for this secret compartment, protected for 90 years by the very earth that had caused the disaster. The genius of it was staggering. The crash itself had been the final turn of the key, burying the safe and sealing it from all but the most patient and determined search. A wave of adrenaline and understanding washed through her. This was what her father had seen. Not the wreck, but the secret it held. He must have found the markings, just as she had, and understood their promise. He just never had the time, or the strength, to finish the work. A profound sense of purpose settled over her. This was no longer just her inheritance. It was her duty. She had to finish the journey her father had started, to open the door he had only been able to find. The ravine was no longer silent. It was humming with a 90-year-old secret, and she was finally beginning to understand its language. Opening the hatch was a battle of rust, mechanics, and sheer will. The lock was a masterpiece of its time, designed to resist force, and 90 years of corrosion had fused its tumblers into a stubborn, solid block. Wren had only her father's old tools, a heavy wrench, a set of files, and a can of lubricating oil Jed had insisted she take. She spent the first day just cleaning the mechanism, using a fine wire brush to clear away the packed dirt and rust, revealing the intricate dial marked with degrees, like a ship's compass. Then she began to work the combination. 44R. She set the dial and tried to turn the wheel. Nothing. She applied the oil, letting it seep into the tiny seams, and tried again. A faint creak. Hope surged through her. 12L. The dial clicked softly as she turned it past the 0 mark. 3. She wasn't sure if the final number was a degree or a turn. She tried both. On the third full turn to the right, something deep within the mechanism gave way, with a heavy, grinding clunk. It echoed in the quiet of the ravine. She held her breath and put both hands on the wheel. She pulled. It resisted, then scraped, then slowly, grudgingly, began to move. The hatch swung downward on protesting hinges, revealing a dark, square opening. The air that wafted out was cool and dry, smelling not of rot and decay, but of old paper, oilcloth, and something else, a faint, clean, mineral scent, like a freshly broken stone. It was a small compartment, no more than 4 feet square, but it was packed to the ceiling. There were a half-dozen slender copper cylinders, sealed with wax, and several large bundles wrapped in thick, waterproofed oilskin and tied with leather straps. Everything was perfectly, impossibly, preserved. The car's nose-down position in the fissure had created a near-perfect tomb, the earth wicking away moisture, the steel shell protecting the contents from the elements. Carefully, reverently, she pulled one of the oilskin bundles out into the daylight. Her hands trembled as she untied the leather straps. Inside was a thick ledger, its leather cover still supple. She opened it. The pages were filled not with lists of cargo or shipping manifests, but with dense, elegant handwriting and exquisitely detailed drawings. They were geological cross-sections of the valley, sketches of rock strata, and chemical notations. She flipped through the pages, her heart hammering against her ribs. There were maps, unbelievably detailed maps of the entire Copper Gulch region, but they showed something that didn't exist on any other map. A network of blue lines, drawn and labeled with notes on depth and flow rate. They were underground rivers, aquifers, a vast hidden water source flowing directly beneath the parched, drought-stricken valley. She grabbed one of the copper cylinders. It was heavy. After a struggle, she managed to pry off the wax-sealed lid. Inside, nestled in sawdust, were long, cylindrical pieces of stone, each carefully labeled with a paper tag. Core samples, the physical proof of the maps. A name was written on the inside cover of the ledger. Alistair Finch, Geological Survey and Prospecting. He must have been a passenger on the train, a visionary geologist who had charted the secret lifeblood of the valley and had died in the crash, his life's work lost with him, lost until now. Wren sank back on her heels, the ledger open on her lap, the sheer magnitude of the discovery washing over her. This was the secret. Not gold, not jewels, but something infinitely more precious in this arid land. Water. A future. It was a treasure that could not be spent, only grown. She looked up at the rusted shell of car 734, no longer seeing a tombstone, but a seed vault, a library, a promise that had patiently waited for someone to come and read its pages. Her father hadn't left her a piece of the past. He had left her a map to the future. The sky had been a searing, cloudless blue for weeks, but that afternoon, a change began. Bruised purple clouds gathered on the horizon, their bellies dark and heavy. The air grew thick and still, the kind of oppressive silence that comes before a storm on the plains. Wren, absorbed in her work, barely noticed until the first gust of wind tore through the ravine, kicking up a spiral of dust and rattling the loose panels of the boxcar. She had managed to move 3 of the copper cylinders and 2 of the ledgers to the relative safety of her camp on the rim, a back-breaking task of hauling them up the slope with ropes. But more than half the discovery remained in the compartment. A distant rumble of thunder echoed, closer than she expected. The storms in this part of the country were sudden and violent. The dry creek bed that snaked through the ravine could become a raging torrent in minutes, a flash flood. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She had to get the rest of the maps out. She scrambled back down into the ravine, the wind now whipping at her clothes, the sky darkening with alarming speed. She began to haul another oilskin bundle from the hatch just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. They hit the hot rock with a sizzle. Then the heavens opened. It was not rain. It was a deluge, a solid sheet of water that turned the world gray and roaring. The ravine floor, baked hard by the sun, did not absorb the water. It channeled it. A trickle became a stream. A stream became a brown, churning river in the space of a minute. The water was rising, swirling around her ankles, then her knees. She heard a shout, thin and desperate, nearly lost in the roar of the storm. Peering through the curtain of rain, she saw them. A family, a man, a woman, and 2 small children. Their wagon caught sideways in the rising water farther down the gulch. One of its wheels was broken, and their horse was panicked, threatening to pull the whole thing apart. They were trapped. Wren's mind raced. The maps, the cylinders, her father's legacy. But then she saw the face of the little girl, pale with terror, clinging to her mother. There was no choice. There was never a choice. She secured the bundle she held, shoving it back into the hatch and forcing the heavy door shut against the current. Then, grabbing the coil of rope she'd used for hauling, she fought her way through the rising, debris-filled water toward the stranded family. The current was a physical force, trying to tear her from her feet. "Here!" she yelled, her voice raw. "To the train car! It's anchored in the rock." The man, whose name she would later learn was Miller, looked at her, then at the immense, stable form of the Iron Needle. Hope flickered in his eyes. Wren threw him the end of the rope. "Tie it to the wagon frame. Get the children." Together, they worked in the maelstrom. She braced herself against a boulder, while Miller secured the rope. Then, hand over hand, they pulled the family through the torrent, toward the safety of the boxcar, the one solid, immovable thing in a world of chaos. They huddled in its lee, the steel shell taking the brunt of the flood's force, the water raging past them. Wren had risked losing everything she had just found to save a family she didn't know. As the floodwaters crested, she pressed her back against the cold, wet steel of car 734, sheltering strangers under the wing of her inheritance, and understood that some treasures had to be earned more than once. The storm broke as quickly as it had arrived. The floodwaters receded, leaving behind a thick coat of mud and a rearranged landscape of debris. The Millers' wagon was a wreck, but they were safe, huddled together, shivering but alive. Mr. Miller gripped Wren's hand, his eyes filled with a gratitude so profound it needed no words. "You saved us," he finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. "We would have been swept away. My family—" He couldn't finish. Wren just nodded, her exhaustion a heavy weight in her bones. She had saved them, but as she looked at the half-submerged hatch of the compartment, a cold fear washed through her. Had she saved them at the cost of everything else? It took 2 days for the ravine to dry out enough for Mr. Miller to walk back to town for help. He returned with Jed and a small group of men, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern. The story of the rescue had already spread through Copper Gulch like a grass fire. When Miller told them how Wren had used the old wreck as an anchor, how she had risked her own life for his family, the way they looked at her began to change. The pity was gone, replaced by a grudging, then a genuine respect. While Jed helped the Millers salvage what they could, Wren went to work on the hatch. It was packed with mud and silt. With a heavy heart, she pried it open again. The compartment had taken on water, but the oilskin and the wax-sealed copper had done their job. The contents were damp, but they were intact. The ink on the maps had not run. The core samples were secure. Relief washed over her, so potent it almost brought her to her knees. A week later, a stranger rode into town. He was an engineer named David Sterling, part of a survey team for a new railroad spur, considering a route through the high country. He had heard the wild story from the Millers. A flash flood, a heroic rescue, and something about old maps found in the legendary Tumble Creek wreck. Intrigued, he sought Wren out. She was hesitant at first, protective of her discovery, but there was a quiet competence about Sterling that she trusted. She showed him one of the ledgers. He spread the map out on a table in the mercantile, his practiced eyes tracing the blue lines, and Alistair Finch's precise notations. A hush fell over the small crowd that had gathered. Silas Blackwood was there, drawn by the commotion, a skeptical sneer on his face. Sterling was silent for a long time. Then he looked up, his expression one of pure, unadulterated awe. "My God," he breathed. "Do you know what this is?" He looked at Wren, then at the townspeople. "This is the lost survey of Alistair Finch. He was a genius, a visionary, 20 years ahead of his time. They said his work was lost in the '88 derailment." He tapped the map. "These aquifers, if they're real, there's enough water under this valley to turn it into a garden, enough to support a new town, a railroad depot, anything." Blackwood scoffed. "Old drawings, a dead man's fantasy." Sterling picked up one of the core samples Wren had brought. "This isn't fantasy," he said, his voice sharp. "This is science. This sample shows a water table at less than 200 feet. Finch didn't just guess. He proved it." He looked directly at Blackwood, whose own ranch lands were slowly turning to dust from the ongoing drought. This worthless ravine, Mr. Blackwood, holds the key to the future of this entire region. The sneer on Silas Blackwood's face finally crumbled, replaced by a stunned, humbled silence. The townspeople looked from the map, to Wren, to the ravine on the horizon, their world tilting on its axis. The Iron Needle was no longer a tombstone. It was a wellspring. The golden hour light slanted across the valley, turning the dust motes to shimmering gold. Wren stood at the edge of Tumble Creek Ravine, looking down at the boxcar. It no longer looked like a monument to failure. It looked like a promise kept. Below, a dozen people from Copper Gulch, including some who had once whispered about the Delaney girl's folly, were carefully, methodically, helping to transport the rest of Alistair Finch's legacy up from the ravine floor. They worked with a reverence usually reserved for holy places. Jed came and stood beside her, the two of them watching the quiet, purposeful work in comfortable silence. Dust, the old mule, stood nearby, his ears flicking, a steadfast observer to the end. "They're talking about forming a water cooperative," Jed said, his voice low. "Talking about planting orchards in the South Quarter, where the soil is richest. Sterling is helping them draw up the plans. Even Blackwood offered to invest. Seems seeing the truth can make a man humble." He paused, then looked at Wren, his weathered face soft with an emotion she couldn't quite name. It was pride. "Your pa would have liked this," he murmured. "He always believed there was more to this land than what you could see on the surface. He never got to prove it." Wren thought of her father, of his calloused hands and his quiet, enduring hope. She thought of the deed, his last desperate purchase, the final act of a man who refused to believe in endings. He hadn't been able to unearth the secret himself, but he had done something just as important. He had saved the key. He had passed it on. He had trusted her to find the lock. She looked down at the great iron needle, stitched into the earth, and saw not a scar, but a suture, a thing that had joined the past to the future. Jed followed her gaze. "What do you suppose he was thinking, buying this place?" he asked softly. Wren drew a deep breath of the cool evening air, the scent of dust and distant rain filling her lungs. A quiet smile touched her lips. "He always said he had nothing to leave me," she said, her voice clear and steady in the evening calm. "He was wrong. He left me the future." Thank you for staying with us for Wren's story to the very end. It's a powerful reminder that true value is often hidden beneath the surface, waiting for a little patience and a lot of heart. If you were moved by her journey of finding purpose in what was forgotten, please give this video a like and let us know your favorite part in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe for more stories of quiet courage and incredible discoveries. We'll see you next time.